Hi, welcome everybody to Understanding Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder in Veterans, a conversation with Kathleen Platoni. But before we get started, a real quick word from our sponsor, which conveniently enough is me. So if you're not a member, if your organization is not already a member to our training, just want to give you a real quick update on what we have available. So we got, I don't know, about 40 hours worth of training, including our basic de-escalation series, which is designed around individuals struggling with homelessness, mental health issues, substance use, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and the like. Crisis series, so basically how do you handle really spicy stuff. Special populations, so a little bit deeper dive into mental illness, substance use, the teenage brain, dementia, which actually unfortunately can lead to a lot of problematic behavior. And then special situations. What do you do when somebody's got some bad body odor or hoarding disorder or prejudicial comments or sexual harassment? And then finally, our management series, like how do you handle burnout and stress in your team, and how do you coach people around de-escalation? If that interests you, we let one person per organization do a free 2-week trial. You can literally try all of our trainings for free. homelesstraining.com/free-trial. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. Super excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Kathy Platoni. So I'm going to just read off her quasi resume here because it is worth getting the whole thing because she is super impressive here. Okay, so practicing clinical psychologist, 41 years of military service, 41 years, holy cow, including 4 deployments during times of war, starting with Desert Storm in 91, that was a stateside deployment, then Iraq in, I think, 04 and 06, Afghanistan in 09. She was commander of the 1972nd Medical Detachment Combat Stress Control at Guantanamo Bay from 2003 to 2004. That was when Guantanamo Bay was a spicy place. Survivor of the Fort Hood massacre in November 2009. She did disaster mental health counselor in New York City after 9/11. She's an assistant clinical psychology professor. She's authored over 100 articles. She's edited 3 books, and she's the editor of Combat Stress magazine. So knows a thing or two about veterans and about PTSD. So I am super excited. Dr. Platoni, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful welcome.
So anything else? Like I kind of gave everybody the kind of rundown. Anything else you want to share about yourself? Maybe that's not part of your official CV?
Sure. Well, I've co-authored 2 books on war trauma, and a 3rd book for my alma mater, co-authored, dedicated to all of the veterans that attended Hobart and William Smith colleges in Geneva, New York. And we are working on a 4th book, which is a full expose about the true facts behind the Fort Hood massacre. That's when I'll probably have to go into hiding.
Yeah, I'll bet. All right, let's dive on in. So I want to start. So basically, here's how we're going to structure today. We're going to start by talking about combat vets specifically, or kind of generally, and then we'll move over to talking about veterans and PTSD specifically. So again, this first part's going to be kind of combat vets generally. And let's start with the presumption that most of the people on this call are not combat vets themselves.
Okay.
They might be interacting with them, whether that's in a library, in a case management situation, but they're trying to understand someone who's been deployed during war, who's been to war, which I have to imagine is something that if you've never been to war, you probably can't actually understand in any way, shape, or form what that's like. So
very true.
If you've not been to war yourself and you need to support people who have, what do you need to know in order to do that effectively?
You need to be able to understand from their perspective what going to war is like. And unless you walk in those boots, it's impossible to fully understand or perceive the horrors of war that so many combat veterans bring home. And in the current urban warfare environment, there is no rear echelon. Everybody's on the front lines. So nobody is in the rear echelon. So if you're deployed overseas during time of war or conflict, as many troops are being deployed right now into conflict, even though there's no official declaration of war, you're going to be exposed to a tremendous amount of trauma that is incomparable to anything you've seen in the States, unless you've been in a mass shooting or a massacre or some horrific traumatic event. So combat stress or traumatic stress is not unique to the wartime theater. It happens over here as well. But when you come home, your old self isn't hanging in the closet, and so many people fail to understand what our combat veterans have been through, regardless of the war or the deployment. There's no off switch for the kinds of emotional and psychological reactions to combat, to living in horrifically adverse conditions, dealing with toxic leadership. You can't go home at night, so you're stuck there, sometimes being battered and abused beyond what one would ever expect from their leadership. So combat is a unique experience, again, that there's no match for it here in the civilian world.
Okay, so that's fascinating. I never thought about that. So when you think about being deployed, particularly during times of war, you think about the stressors and the trauma around war, around combat. But I never thought about the fact that you have all the ordinary stressors that might be magnified because during war, best practices are probably going out the window. So in time of war, if you got a commander who's maybe not very good at managing his or her troops, that might actually just be allowed to keep going because there's just not the time. I'm sorry, my mind's already blown because I never even thought about that. But I don't have a question, just more like, holy cow.
If you want some great examples, I got a million of them. But toxic leadership was an enormous problem in the combat theater during my deployments. And for all of the soldiers and Marines that I supported, even when I came back, who were still in the combat theater. As a shining example, when I was at Fob Wilson in southern Afghanistan, it was about 60 clicks west of Kandahar, small remote forward operating base. We had a salmonella outbreak, and this was caused by the chow hall manager. And I know it sounds like I'm making this up, but you can't make this stuff up. The chow hall manager was serving the same food day after day after day until it was unrecognizable as what it was originally. So everything looked like a toxic stew, and people were getting sick. I realized some of this sounds rather gruesome, but the latrines were overflowing. It's not like we have flushing toilets at these remote remote locations. So I happened to let one of my colleagues know about this on one of the days that we did have internet, and one of our military trucks hadn't dug up the fiber optic cable. And she said, do you want me to notify Senator so and so? And I said, what the hell? Why not? Go for it. Well, within about 4 days, the chow hall manager was removed. I was summoned to the flagpole, which means I had to get on a Chinook and fly to Kandahar to face my commander, who, by the way, I outranked a lot. She was a major. I'm a full bird colonel. So, um, and the brigade commander, same rank as me, was also there. And I had to defend myself and prove that I wasn't mentally ill for reporting horrific conditions that were making soldiers extremely ill. So they were not mission capable. I was embedded with the 4th Infantry Division at the time, and sit there and smile and take it. Well, as it turned out, the brigade commander was a wise man and made sure that chow hall manager was indeed removed, and I got the best performance evaluation of my entire military career from him. But nevertheless, it was an extremely punitive situation. It was very traumatizing. And again, it's not like you can go home at night and get support from your family. You're stuck there for a 11 to 12 month deployment. So this kind of toxic leadership is very commonplace in the combat theater. I don't know how leaders are selected. I was not a commander. I'm a clinician, didn't want to be a commander because, as we often said in the combat theater, the people in the ivory towers of commands have no idea of the sweat and toil of a battlefield, and that rings true.
Hmm.
There is an excellent book that my NCOIC, that's the non-commissioned officer in charge of the clinic, um, wrote. She was my NCOIC in Ramadi, Iraq during the height of the war and the seat of the insurgency. She wrote a blockbuster book called Quixote in Ramadi, which is an absolutely true account of everything that went on under some very, very toxic leadership. Every word is true. The only name that wasn't changed to protect the innocent is mine. So I was a lieutenant colonel at the time. I think Quixote in Ramadi is only available in audiobook at this point, but well worth the read if you want to understand the betrayal, the traumatic betrayal of illicit commands that have no business being in charge. And the author is Michelle Wilmot.
Thank you. Thank you.
So beautiful example. And I've seen so many soldiers and Marines, primarily soldiers, US Army, become suicidal because there was nobody to support them. Everybody turned against them. Um, they had nowhere to turn. It's a very ugly scenario. And not only is that a traumatic injury resulting all too often in PTSD, but a moral injury where your very basic beliefs, your morals, your ethics, your values are all violated by somebody who has a lot more power than you, or by seeing things in the combat theater that violate those very same principles. So
Hmm.
this book tells the real story.
Thank you. Okay.
But
I'm sorry, go ahead.
combat, the first time you experience combat, it's like the ground opened up beneath you. Um, it's something that you cannot prepare for, no matter how much infantry training you have prior to your deployment. It's the real deal. The first IED explosion, the first mortar that goes off of 20 feet in front of you, the first rocket propelled grenade, the first rocket, small arms fire, whatever. Um, this is unfortunately what we wake up to every morning, and you always sleep with one boot on the floor, on the ground, because you may have to run quickly, run for cover.
So, real practically, what advice do you have for those of us who might have to serve combat veterans? So, like, what are the do's and don'ts?
You know, it's so important to first and foremost never be judgmental. It's important to listen carefully, to not push them to talk about things that they're not ready to talk about, to give them a safe environment where they can open up. And some people really never do. Um, as an example, I had a patient who's not a combat veteran, but this is a beautiful example. She is a firefighter paramedic, and she came in here. I thought her head was going to blow off her body. She said, I don't want to unpack any of my trauma. I'm not ready to deal with it, while tears were streaming down her face. So I asked her, well, would you rather keep stuffing it down and wait for it to spew forth when you least expect it? Or would you like to let go of it? Because healing will only happen when your silence is broken. And as she absolutely refused to talk about it, she was still talking about the trauma that she had witnessed on the job as a paramedic. And it just all came flowing out through the tears. It's important to let people pace what they are willing to tell you. But a lot of our veterans and a lot of our active duty military personnel, reservists, guardsmen and women have to be ready to talk. It's got to be the right time, the right place, and there's got to be trust. Those who are asking the questions, family members, friends, other professionals, have to be a good listener and never say, I know how you felt. Or that's just like when no, it's not like when you did anything. It's not like anything unless you've served in a combat zone. Um, it's important to let the connection develop naturally and not push it. I'll give you a beautiful example of that. Several years ago, I went to dinner with a licensed professional counselor. This is not about degree or training. And this was shortly after I returned from Afghanistan in 2010. And she said to me, I know how you feel, but you must have been very young when you deployed, having no idea that the war in Afghanistan was still raging at the time. She was also treating military personnel and veterans. She also said, well, how come you know what combat's like? You're a psychologist. So the insults and the ignorance kept coming. It took every ounce of strength I had not to take the dinner table and push it over on her, or ask her to step outside where we could settle the score. It was a pretty nasty situation. So never, ever, ever say, get over it. I know how you feel. That's just like when I experience it. No, it's not. You've got to listen, not judge, and oftentimes not comment other than to say thank you for being open about your experience, or thank you for sharing your experience. Teach me what it is like. And it's very important for anybody treating a combat veteran to say the same thing. Teach me what I need to know so that I can best help you. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues in this area of Ohio have never served in the military. So it's a very small population that have experienced combat themselves. I think I'm the only combat veteran psychologist. There may be two of us in the entire state of Ohio that I know of. So finding the right person and teaching people how to listen without judging. Listen actively. Don't necessarily say anything, but nod your head and say, I understand. Thank you for sharing.
I love what you just said about asking the person to, hey, teach me what I need to know. It's such a, if you actually think about it, it's such an obvious tool to help somebody, and yet it's so completely not obvious.
That's so completely
We
obvious.
know we don't know, but we don't have the we know we don't know, but we don't have the humility to say, but you do. So just tell me. And I'm just thinking of all the applications. I've never been homeless. If somebody's homeless, hey, teach me what I need to know in order to understand homelessness and help you better, or veterans, or anything else where you've
Absolutely.
not had that personal experience. So I love that. I'm totally stealing that. I might give you credit.
Oh, absolutely. If you could take full credit.
Okay, before we move into PTSD, any advice you'd have for combat veterans themselves? Because I'm sure there are some actual combat veterans on this webinar. It's not just people who have not experienced that. Any advice for them before we move into PTSD?
Absolutely. You know, about a year and a half after I returned from Afghanistan with a whole lot of pent up anger and rage, one of my best friends who I had deployed with twice said to me, you need to get help. Nobody comes back unscathed. Your old, as I mentioned before, your old self is not hanging in the closet. Um, our society is ripe with people who cannot appreciate the experiences of combat. Get help. It takes a much stronger person, a much more courageous person to say, I cannot do this all alone. I don't have all the answers. Get help. And I've been in therapy since 2012 at the Dayton Veterans Readjustment Counseling Center. I'm going to self disclose. And thank God for my counselor. He is a veteran, Air Force veteran, and a licensed independent social worker, and he is my go to. There is none of us that returns from the combat theater without burdens that need to be unloaded and unburdened. That is the best advice I can give. You need a sense of, you need to have a social support system. You need to have a mental health support system. You need to feel safe coming back to this society. We didn't feel safe over there, but interestingly enough, many of us feel less safe coming home because we're in no man's land.
Back to
So
your original point about getting therapy. Where's the line? Is the line if you've been to combat, you should have a therapist, or is it if you've been to combat and you're starting to see some anger issues? Like where's the line in your opinion?
if what you brought home from an emotional or psychological standpoint um, is affecting your sleep, it's affecting your relationships, it's affecting your job or your ability to get a job. Um, if you're lost in flashbacks and nightmares and intrusive, disturbing, and unwanted memories, then it's time to get help. What the Army has done, and in fact, I'm one of the forerunners of this, um, is providing group support to all returning veterans to help them deal with what they brought back. I don't know where that stands right now in the active component or even the reserve component, but a lot of wise brigade commanders made that happen. When I was returning from Iraq, the brigade commander of um, the 3rd Infantry Division asked me to return to Kelly Hill at Fort Benning with them to provide for reintegration and reunification um, services so that everybody who deployed could be seen at least in a group setting, most of them in an individual setting, and many times with family members present so the family could help understand the dynamics of what these returning veterans were bringing home in terms of some pretty horrific burdens.
That's
So
super cool.
I'm hoping the military is still doing that. I think that's the best way to introduce the idea of getting help, because oftentimes those reintegration briefings are just not enough.
That makes total sense. That makes total sense. All right, let's move over to PTSD. So, something I talk a lot about. So, anybody who's familiar with my training is probably tired of hearing about PTSD because it's so. Little plug there. 54% of chronically homeless individuals suffer from PTSD, and so and virtually 100% have trauma. So PTSD is very prevalent in homelessness, but also obviously war. So, can you give your kind of maybe 2-3 minute explanation of PTSD from your standpoint?
Sure. PTSD is a psychological injury and a brain injury. And sometime during our talk, I'm hoping that I can tell you a little bit about PTSD and the brain. But PTSD results from being exposed directly to a trauma or indirectly to a trauma that a close friend or relative was exposed to. You don't have to have witnessed it in person. Um, just hearing about some of the horrific things that have happened to people can elicit the onset of PTSD, probably far less so than those who actually witnessed a trauma. I say it's a psychological injury because it's a normal reaction. Yes, post-traumatic stress disorder is a normal reaction to extremely abnormal life circumstances. Yeah, combat and going to war is certainly one of them. PTSD can also come about as a result of repeated indirect exposure to the aversive details of an event, usually in the course of professional duties. Um, and that happens quite often with first responders, mortuary teams, professionals who are repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse or child sexual assault. This does not include being exposed to it through the media, but through the details being shared in the line of duty, so to speak. The second criterion for PTSD is recurrent, involuntary, unwanted, and disturbing memories that are persistently re-experienced, traumatic nightmares, dissociative reactions, which includes flashbacks. And flashbacks are an actual reliving of traumatic events as if they were occurring in real time. Intense and prolonged distress, after exposure to traumatic reminders, which are everywhere in our environment, and a high level of stress reactivity or physical reactivity after exposure to trauma related stimuli. Then we have the avoidance criterion, trying to avoid any discussion of anything traumatic in the way of thoughts, feelings, or memories, trying to avoid any external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, or situations. And it's amazing how many triggers are in our environment here that are reminiscent of what we experienced over there. Next criterion is negative alterations in cognition and mood. It is very common to be unable to recall some aspects of traumatic events because when you're in that heightened state of that adrenaline rush, a lot of memories are not necessarily recorded. So, surprisingly, even though these horrific events, how could you forget? Some aspects are often not remembered. Persistent negative beliefs about the world, about oneself, about people. The world is a completely horrible, negative, dangerous place. It's hard not to feel that way, especially when you feel threatened coming home because nobody understands where your head lies. Persistent, distorted beliefs about blaming others, including the self, excessive guilt and self blame, huge problem with combat veterans. Survivor guilt, huge problem with combat veterans. A lot of negative emotions that are repetitively experienced, such as fear, horror, shame, guilt, and anger. Those are some of the negative alterations in cognition and mood. Then we have also negative alterations in cognition and mood, what we call anhedonia, or markedly diminished interest in significant pleasurable activities. A lot of us have lost our ability to feel joy in this life. I have to go skydiving to really feel joy. So I know, nuts. But losing interest in things that once brought such happiness is a very hard thing to climb back to. Feeling alienated or estranged or detached from others, psychic numbing, just being unable to experience positive emotions at all. A persistent inability to experience positive emotions. That's that inability to find joy. Then the next criterion is alterations in arousal and reactivity. These are probably some of those that most of your listeners have heard about. Irritable or aggressive behavior, that PTSD and violence are not necessarily related at all. Self-destructive or reckless behavior, trying to recreate that same adrenaline high. Hypervigilance, being on guard. There is no safe place. The world is a very threatening place. Perfect example is going out into public and being unable to tolerate crowds, or being in a restaurant or a coffee shop and having to face the door because you've got to know who's coming in case you need to react. Exaggerated hyperstartle response. When I first came home from Afghanistan, oftentimes I would have to explain to patients why I was under my desk. I have a brass mailbox outside the front door, and the mail carriers often very clumsily try to stick the mail in the slot, and it sounds like somebody's trying to break in. So for the first months back from Afghanistan, I had to explain why I was under the desk. That is what exaggerated hyperstartle response looks like. That's why so many of us have difficulties with fireworks on the 4th of July, because that sounds like gunfire or an IED explosion or a mortar attack. So that's very reminiscent of what we experienced over there. Problems with attention, concentration, and focusing, also a very large problem. And sleep disturbances. being unable to fall asleep, being unable to stay asleep, with constant nighttime awakenings, and being up all night, sometimes for days on end, unable to sleep because people are so spun up in this web of negative emotions. Um, they the other important thing to know about PTSD is that you have to have demonstrated and experienced these symptoms for at least a month before a diagnosis can be rendered. But it's not the diagnosis that's important, it's treating the symptoms that are important. The diagnosis is only for reimbursement purposes with insurance companies, unfortunately, and they do not qualify PTSD as a psychological injury, which it is. And as Sam Carroll just said, your body has trained itself for survival. And that's why a lot of these behaviors are adaptive in the combat theater, not so much back here unless you're a first responder. So that's what PTSD looks like.
Thank you. So I have three comments. One is, you're the second psychologist who's told me that mental health diagnoses are purely for insurance reimbursement purposes and nothing else. Fascinating. Two, that list sounds absolutely horrible. And three, I kind of want to remind everybody that while she was running through that list, you were, again, probably picturing combat veterans, but also remember, all of that is half of chronically homeless individuals. So if you work at a shelter,
Yes.
a good number of the people in that room are experiencing everything she just described on a daily basis. And, talk about crowds with trying to sleep in a crowded shelter. So
Right. Yeah, there's probably not a whole lot of sleeping going on there.
it's rough. So, okay. So for people who have to serve individuals with PTSD, whether it's combat or not, but specifically combat, what else do we need to know? And more importantly, what do we need to do and not do?
Okay. Again, the same applies as we talked to you earlier about being able to allow these people to talk, or to encourage them to talk, or to get them to a place where they feel safe, is to be patient, to listen without judging, to encourage them to talk, to get them hooked up with resources, mental health resources, medical resources, service dog resources, housing if it's available, recreating family relationships if at all possible. These are tasks that are not easily done. And it is very hard to establish trust, but it does happen. It's all about listening and creating a safe place and allowing these veterans to pace themselves. You may not get anything the first 2, 3, 4, or 10 times you try to engage them. And the same holds true for first responders. But once you develop that reputation in a shelter, for instance, at being someone that really listens and tries to understand and says, teach me what it's like for you so that I can help you, you are off to a great start.
So something just kind of clicked while you were talking, and that's that we tend to think of PTSD, because we tend to think of PTSD primarily in a combat context. We always think about it as the person is back from war. So theoretically, they're safe now, at least, objectively speaking, theoretically.
Mm-hmm.
But what kind of dawned on me is, like, how does the military treat PTSD while the person's still overseas in the combat theater versus when they're back? And the reason I ask that is that for the other context for PTSD, chronic homelessness, first responder, the trauma that's creating the PTSD is likely ongoing. So they're no longer removed from the trauma, and some of the behaviors that are associated with the PTSD are actually helpful for survival mode. So
Yes,
how do you think about it? So how do you think about PTSD as different when the person's still actively in trauma versus when they've gotten out of trauma?
You know, that's a brilliant question. Brilliant question. In the combat theater, the Army sends forward combat stress control teams. Unfortunately, they're not always able to reach all of the different remote outposts and forward operating bases in the combat theater. But we try. We did a lot of traveling under extremely dangerous conditions to reach every unit and every outpost when there were critical incidents. Of course, there's critical incidents all day long, every day. So it's a nearly impossible task. And we certainly do not have enough mental health professionals and chaplains who are part of the combat stress control movement to cover an entire country like Iraq or Afghanistan or Kuwait or Syria or wherever. But this is the best we have to offer. To provide on-site services as far forward as possible to everybody who has been traumatized. Unfortunately, there's so much trauma going on. It is impossible to reach everyone. So in theory, great thing. In reality, you can't get to everybody. But my job as an Army psychologist with my team of social workers, psychiatric nurse practitioners, and behavioral science specialists was to keep everybody mission capable. Oh, that's an overwhelming task. Some people thrive on combat. But even then, when you lose a buddy that you just had breakfast with, it's very hard to be able to go back on mission. And that's often what's demanded of soldiers and Marines and Air Force personnel and Navy Seabees and everybody else who ends up in the combat theater. We try to instill in as many of these military personnel as possible just some basic coping skills, like breathing techniques to help them gear down. But you have got to be mission capable. Your job is to stop the enemy and, unfortunately, to kill the enemy more so than anything else, and to keep people in that frame of mind and in that adrenaline rich state is what needs to be done. So there's a fine line between being able to help them and help them de-escalate, but to keep them able to perform their missions. Sometimes after half your company is wiped out and you've seen your buddies die in front of you, you have to go back on mission. That's the ugly reality of war. There were some soldiers that I treated every single day to keep them on mission. And I went out on infantry missions several times a week. So I was there with them as they were performing their missions, and they knew I had their backs as best as I could. I also had my M16 and my 9mm Beretta. So, but one of the things that we are taught to do and required to do is to medevacuate or medevac military personnel back to the states if they aren't mission capable. But that is its own brand of terrible things, because the survivor guilt and abandoning their buddies because they do not have the requisite skills to continue performing the combat theater is a dangerous thing to do. So I did everything in my power, unless people were really homicidal or suicidal, to keep people on mission and not send them home. But if you're burning down the tent and setting fires, yeah, you're going home. So
yeah, that makes sense. I'm so as you were talking, I'm just picturing, why is there not a movie about an Army psychologist like in bed? I would be fascinated to watch that movie. So if anybody's got any connections, see if you can make that happen. What about PTSD and safety? So if we're working with somebody who's got PTSD, combat, non-combat. What do we need to know? What do we need to do in order to keep ourselves safe? Because while, obviously not everybody with PTSD is violent, but there is going to be an uptick in aggression and there's going to be an uptick in violence. And so what do we need to do?
What we need to do is understand, first of all, that anger is a very common response to events that seem unfair or unjust, or seeing the enemy kill your fellow soldiers or Marines or whatever, or the adverse conditions in which we are forced to live because under certain administrations, we were denied the very, very basics, including uniforms that would stay together and boots that you could actually wear on your feet. So anger is a common thing in the combat theater. It's almost impossible not to be angry at some of the things that you deal with. But bringing that home is not always adaptive. So it's important to look for signs that somebody is about to become aggressive towards you. Always leave yourself an exit strategy or an escape route. But, you know, even with people who have deployed multiple times, that kind of pathological anger is still relatively rare. But sometimes circumstances on the home front will reignite every bit of that when you are constantly rejected by your family because they can't tolerate living with you anymore. You can't get your benefits. You're without your buddies who get you. Yeah, it's not hard to understand how people stay angry. Um, anger anger happens so easily because when you get into that arousal state with PTSD, anger is part and parcel of that PTSD complex of symptoms. And it's linked to survival. Um, Again, it's hard to turn that off when you come back. Listen intently and with patience, but always as a listener or therapist or caseworker or a family member or a librarian or whatever, look for the signs that somebody is beginning to escalate in their anger. That's when it's time to change the subject. Ask them if they need something to drink. Ask them how you can help them. Um, Help them do some deep breathing exercises if the setting is appropriate for that. And sometimes it's hard to get a handle on that. But sooner or later, people you cannot remain in that state and survive forever. Sooner or later, yes, and box breathing, which is one of the techniques I'm going to talk about during our talk today. But it's important to just have some basic understanding of how anger can manifest in a combat veteran. Sometimes, well, usually all the time, um, helping them to get out of a situation where they're feeling locked in or closed in and they're escalating into anger. Um, Take a walk with them. You may need to keep a little bit of a distance, but any kind of physical exercise or physical release is an automatic way to help people de-escalate. I'm hoping I'm answering your question. Um, People will become aggressive to protect themselves. You have to help them feel safe.
The physical activity, I've never heard that before. That's fantastic. So that's one of my takeaways from today. So thank you.
Oh, yes. The mental health benefits of exercise are probably greater than the physical benefits, as great as the physical benefits are, because you are generating your own a release of your own natural opiates, your own endorphins and enkephalins into the bloodstream, and a release of serotonin, the mood altering chemical in your brain, into the bloodstream.
Yeah, totally unrelated.
So,
It's also the only thing that's clinically proven to increase IQ, by the way, that's just fascinating. But that
good
was
to
just a
know.
side. Yeah, exactly. I just read that this week. Okay, so I want to move over to Q&A, but real quick, any advice for vets or non-vets who think they may have PTSD? And obviously, I'm presuming you're going to say get some help, but anything kind of more nuanced than that?
You know what? Read, understand PTSD, understand what the various treatment options are. understand or find those professionals in the community that are talented in treating PTSD. Not everybody is. And a call to the the state board of psychologists or licensed professional counselors or social workers might be a great way to find a good clinician in your area. Another great place to look, which is where I go, is the Vet Center or the Veterans Readjustment Counseling Center in your local area. It's important to, really participate in webinars like this that are just ripe with great information. I mean, I looked at some of your previous webinars, and there is a lot of excellent information there that would be just wonderful for people to involve themselves in, to learn about PTSD and the various forms of treatment. There are, I know that I provided a number of resources, books and peer support resources for this talk today that can be made available to the audience. There's a million of them, and some of the best resources involve peer support, which is where the Wounded Warrior Project comes in, and a word on the Wounded Warrior Project in just a minute, and groups through the local VA. Um, there are a number of veteran support groups, Vietnam veterans, Iraq War veterans, Desert Storm veterans. Put them all together because it's the veteran experience. That's one of the things that the VA does well. Vet Center, I think, does it even better than the VA. So that is an important resource. Book lists, understand PTSD, help your family understand PTSD. There's so many wonderful resources out there, and I provided several lists for the audience. It's important to get involved with organizations in your local area. Um, you could find even more resources through the American Legion and the VFW, or Veterans of Foreign Wars, um, meeting places. I've got two VFWs that are begging me to join forces with them, which I'm probably going to do. The one where I live in Beaver Creek, Ohio, and the one where I work, where my office is in Centerville, Ohio, because they do wonderful work with outreach. Absolutely wonderful. Get involved with veterans activities in your area. For instance, our vet center now has an outdoor outreach program, and every weekend they have another kayaking or canoeing trip or something for veterans where they can get together and re-experience that camaraderie, that bonding together. Becoming part of a tribe is such an important aspect of dealing with PTSD and the aftermath of war.
Very cool. Thank you. All right, we're gonna switch over to Q&A. So our first question is from Grant. Any tips for non-combat veterans, of which Grant is one?
You know what? Brilliant question. The same applies. Most of my caseload is made up of first responders, many of whom are veterans themselves. The same applies. There are a huge number of police and fire organizations that do peer support and outreach. PTSD is PTSD. You don't have to have gone to combat to deal with PTSD. PTSD is a reaction to what overloads the system and is beyond horrible. So, outreach for any particular organization, whether you're in police, fire, dispatch, the same applies. Go get help. Um, for instance, Behind the Badge, I believe, is a great organization out of Illinois, and they provide outreach and direction towards the right therapists for dealing with the cumulative trauma and the daily trauma that first responders deal with. The International Association of Firefighters also has tremendous resources. So any of those organizations, with the advent of the internet, it's not hard to find these outreach resources. Participate in them. I can't wait to take my next canoe trip with the local vet center. I'm no, even though I'm a good canoeist, I'm known for flipping canoes and ending up in the soup.
I don't even know what to say to that. I'll just leave that. I'll just leave that last comment there. Thank you. Next question. What steps can one take to ensure that returning vets feel safe? And then there's a little bit more. Basically, how do we create an environment if we don't know what those triggers are necessarily? What do we do? Is it of obviously avoiding firecrackers, but what else can we do to create a safe environment?
I think that almost boils down to the individual who may not even know what the triggers are when they come home from the combat theater. I think it's safe to assume that any kind of loud noises, screaming and yelling kids, as much as you love your kids, um, crowds, um, 4th of July fireworks, any of those things have the potential to be very powerful triggers. Um, I think it's so important to spend quiet time with your veteran, for instance, when you come home, just letting them talk if they're ready, encouraging them to talk, making resources available to them for the community, linking them up with churches. Many churches have a lot of veterans outreach activities. Um, there is, I might have to open one of my books to find it, but there is a wonderful organization, and we may have to do a little research for this, who makes personalized quilts for returning veterans. And not only is that a magnificent gift, but they are usually embroidered with a message for that specific veteran and presented to them in a ceremony as a welcoming home. I know in the reserve, in the Army Reserve, there were always welcome home ceremonies, and in the active component, in which mental health professionals were present to let families and the returning soldiers or Marines know of their existence and that services are available. Um, I think, well, Alicia just mentioned something about a sensory room. I've heard two of my firefighters rave about these sensory rooms. If there's one in your area, it's like a womb room. Tends to be a very relaxing, peaceful environment for people to de-escalate from this all the time. That frantic, frenetic feeling that your head's going to blow off at any moment. There are so many resources. It's that should be accessed, and family members can prepare for this before their soldier or Marine or whatever comes home from the combat theater. Another thing that doesn't happen, and I prided myself on doing this before my soldiers and Marines returned from their deployments. I provided access information for whatever VA was in the area to which they were returning. Um, if they were leaving the military, so that they could file for service-connected disabilities if appropriate, or accessing other veteran services through the vet center or the VA. Very important for that link. I just met with a wounded warrior last week in upstate New York that I had treated every day while in Afghanistan, and he was completely unaware of the burn pit exposure evaluations under the PACT Act that are now available. So making sure that veterans know what is available to them and what resources they have through the VA is so important. So those are the kinds of things. Be ready to have a wealth of resources when they're ready to consider that. Probably the first thing they're going to need when they come back is sleep, because sleep is elusive in the wartime theater. Again, one boot on the floor at all times.
Any specific advice for libraries, and obviously informational, but also, for example, the questioner asked, one veteran had told this individual, "Please don't approach me from behind." That
That
was that.
is, yes, absolutely. If somebody sneaks up behind me, it's all I can do to keep from punching them in the face, even though I weigh like 80 pounds, yeah, that is frightening because it's unexpected, it catches you off guard, and it plays right into that hypervigilance. Never approach someone from behind, always from the front. Oh, that is such a thank you for whoever brought that up. I think libraries are a wonderful place to do veterans outreach. A book club, a reading club, a discussion group, something that reinforces the notion of the tribe. Sebastian Younger, the author of the book Tribe, he wrote The Perfect Storm, which was turned into a movie, and my favorite book, War, talks about the notion of coming home to the same bonds or trying to reforge bonds because nobody knows better than somebody who has been there in the same poop you have. I love the idea of bringing that to the library. And because libraries are supposed to be quiet, I think that might be one of the safest places for our veterans to find themselves and other veterans like themselves.
So I love everything you said. I guarantee you just said a very controversial thing about libraries being quiet, because they are not quiet places anymore because they become community centers. But everything else was
Okay,
pretty awesome.
special room in the library.
There you go. There you go. Okay, I want to. We're running out of time here, so I want to give you a real quick opportunity to plug your stuff if people want to know more.
Okay.
Here's 2 of your 3 books. We were not aware of the third, but there's 2 of the 3. And then we provided a QR code there for your website, which why don't you go ahead and just tell us what the website URL is too? And so if people want to write that down.
Sure. It's www.drplatoni.com.
Dr. Platoni or DOCTOR?
Dr. Platoni. One
DR.
word, Dr. Platoni.
And it's Platoni, correct?
Correct.
Anything else you
Actually,
want to plug?
You know what? I want to plug your show for what it does to help so many who are struggling and suffering and feel that they're alone. This is the kind of thing that really, really works to open up resources and a hope chest filled with all good things. This is quite wonderful. So I thank you for what you do for our veterans, most assuredly.
Thank you. I'm trying to plug you though. You can't plug me, but thank you.
You know what? There's a ton of articles on my website also. So that may be of help or interest. And I really want to plug free subscriptions to Combat Stress Magazine, which comes out quarterly. It is free. Subscriptions are free. It is dedicated to all levels of military personnel, veterans, clinicians, caregivers, and any interested parties. Our spring issue just came out, and you can access that through the American Institute of Stress website. They just changed it, so I don't have the exact website, but just look under American Institute of Stress, and you will find our current issue and all other issues dating back, I think, 12 years now. I'm especially going to plug the spring 2023 issue. And those of you who are interested will know why when you see the cover story, and the spring 2019 issue, because that's where I talk about my father's war service. So I'm very, very, very proud of that. But all of the issues are wonderful. Our authors are all lay people who write magnificently and really tell the tale. So hopefully you will access Combat Stress Magazine on the American Institute of Stress website.
Dr. Platoni, thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation. I learned a ton. I actually took like a bunch of notes. And
I'm honored, believe me.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Have a fantastic week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.